The heads of a number of business and hobby groups testify about the need for federal drone safety regulations. We also hear from FAA Deputy Administrator Michael Whitaker, who was asked about the rulemaking process for drones. This House Aviation Subcommittee hearing is chaired by New Jersey Congressman Frank Lobiondo.
Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing, offer testimony, and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. Today we look forward to hearing from various stakeholders on a very important topic to our country: aviation safety in the era of unmanned aircraft systems. Unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS, represent the latest frontier in aviation technology. While still a new industry, UAS are already contributing to our economy and changing how companies do business. Across the country, we already see UAS used for a myriad of operations, from surveying, photography, safety inspections, medical delivery, and search and rescue. With each new use, businesses and commercial users can save time, money, and even in some cases, lives. But like any other new technology, UAS bring new challenges as well. In the past year, pilots have been reporting sightings of UAS near airports at an accelerating rate. In 2014, the FAA received 238 reports of drone sightings. In 2015, the number has already exceeded 600. Safety is paramount in aviation, and the increased number of suspected sightings raises serious questions and concerns. Some of these reports involved airliners and occurred at low altitudes near the nation's busiest airports. Other reports involve pilots of general aviation aircraft in less busy airspace. The real possibility of mid-air collision must be taken seriously in order to prevent tragic consequences. To be clear, it is also my understanding that some of these reported sightings may involve something other than a consumer unwisely operating their new gadget in a busy, controlled airspace or restricted airspace. In at least some cases, the reported UAS may have been a government-operated aircraft, lawfully operated UAS, or simply a bird in flight. To that end, we need to understand what precisely is going on in our airspace, what is the actual risk, and how do we manage and mitigate it. With retailers readying for significant UAS purchases by American consumers this upcoming holiday season, this conversation and subsequent action cannot wait. There are real consequences if we are not cautious enough, though we must not go to the extreme, which could unnecessarily restrict the UAS industry's growth and innovation here in the United States because of the so-called false positives. The key is balance, and I believe that this committee, as well as the FAA and stakeholders, continue to strive for just that, balance. The answer to these questions will be complex, though I am confident that our country can and will address them. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and thank them for joining us today. Before I recognize Mr. Larson for his comments, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material for the record of this hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd now like to yield to Mr. Larson for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiondo, for holding today's hearing on ensuring aviation safety in an era of unmanned aircraft systems. I'm pleased we're here this morning to address this important and timely topic of the safety of UAS in the national airspace. The number of unmanned aircraft being sold in the U.S. is staggering. According to one industry group, the number of UAS sold this year could reach 700,000. That's a 63% increase over last year. Other reports suggest that figure will soon reach 1 million. And it will continue to grow. So the natural question becomes, who are flying these million-plus unmanned aircraft? Many, as we're going to hear, are responsible and safe users. These include serious hobbyists, such as those represented by the Academy of Model Aeronautics, who are here today, and commercial users with a financial interest in safe, responsible operations. But unfortunately, they also include people who are not familiar with the rules of aviation or concepts of aviation safety. There are 600+ reports of near passes between conventional aircraft and drones so far this year, and that tells us what we need to do more to reduce the likelihood of a drone ending up in the flight path of a commercial airliner with hundreds of people on board. These 600+ pilot sightings suggest that allowing anyone to fly a drone on or near the nation's airways is like letting people drive remote-controlled model cars on the interstate. Unless more is done, it is not if an accident will happen, it is when. Committee staff found some pilot reports in NASA's aviation safety reporting system of some pretty scary encounters. One pilot reported that he, quote, encountered a drone that came close enough to hear the propeller noise from the drone from inside my cabin. The small size of the drone made it impossible to see until it was too late to take any evasive action. And the list continues. In addition to risks in the air, unmanned aircraft pose risks on the ground. This year, an aerial vehicle crashed into parade goers in Seattle, injuring one woman when it crashed into her head. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about what the FAA and stakeholders are doing to address the safety risk before it's too late. But we cannot deny the extensive public and commercial benefits of unmanned aircraft as well. UAS can be used for search and rescue, wildfire mitigation, as well as the inspection of bridges and other critical transportation infrastructure. The UAS industry has great potential to drive growth, create jobs. One industry trade group estimates that in just 10 years, unmanned aircraft will create 100,000 jobs and add $82 billion in value to our economy. It's particularly important to states like my home state of Washington State, a hub of aviation research and development. This committee has an enormous opportunity to be proactive, to listen to these experts today, to understand what Congress can do to help keep our nation's skies safe, and produce legislation about UAS that will reflect our safety agenda while doing no harm to a promising industry. The FAA Act of 2012 directed the FAA to safely integrate unmanned aircraft by 2015 and required the agency to issue regulations on small unmanned aircraft. While FAA expects to issue this delayed rule next year, this action will provide regulation to safely implement primarily commercial operations. The question I hope we get at today is what should Congress do and what can FAA do as well to ensure the safety of recreational UAS operations? Some have said that Section 336 of the 012 bill prohibits the agency from taking any meaningful action to regulate small recreational unmanned aircraft. And I'd caution against a broad interpretation of that provision, which is crafted to apply very narrowly. In fact, in light of all the safety events that have emerged this year, maybe it's time to revisit that provision. So I look forward to hearing from all of our panelists today about what Congress, about what the FAA, and importantly as well, what the industry can do to keep the integration of UAS on track and to ensure safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. I'd like to really thank Rick Larson for the close working relationship, and also Bill Schuster and Peter DeFazio on this very important issue that we spent a lot of time with. Chairman Schuster is not here yet. Mr. DeFazio, some opening remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity, appreciate the fact of you convening the committee on this important topic today. Yes, there is tremendous potential in commercial application of drone technology. But first and foremost, we have to establish the rules that absolutely ensure the integrity and the safety of our aviation system today. We've seen instances mentioned by the ranking member earlier of these toy drones in critical airspace. At this point, we don't really know what happens when you suck a quadcopter into a jet engine. And at my request, the FAA is moving forward with an evaluation. We did, after an investigation in 2009 for Pittsburgh, or 1994, Pittsburgh, possible bird strike, they calculated a 4-pound bird hits an airplane moving at 260 miles an hour, generates a force equal to 14 tons. Well, you have some of these toys up there in the air that weigh that much. And so what could that do if ingested? So we need to know. What are the solutions? Well, clearly there are commercial applications, which the FAA is moving forward with. The issue, I believe, can be kind of drawn between toys and commercial applications. And the toys need to be restricted in terms of where they can operate. That is, they should be programmed before they can be sold so that they can't fly in restricted airspace. They can't fly over 400 feet. And anybody who is found to have hacked that should be subject and operates irresponsibly should be subject to serious penalties and fines. I think we might also have to look at registration. I had an instance in my hometown of Springfield. Somebody, a peeping Tom, was using a little drone, looking with a camera, looking in people's windows. It was cited by the neighbors, and ultimately it crashed. Well, police have no idea who was operating that thing. We have no way to track it back. There should be a way to track these things back to irresponsible operators, people who are using them illegally, improperly, and endangering both personal privacy and potentially safety of the traveling public. I think there is a lot of work to be done. We're going to hear today from the Forest Service. We had interruption in critical firefighting activities this summer because of idiots flying their toy drones into areas where we wanted to operate aircraft to fight the fire, and they had to suspend operations. There needs to be consequences for people who do those sorts of things, and I expect this committee to work with the FAA to see if they have the authority to take proper action against these sort of people, or whether they need new authorities. And we need new regulations so that we can divide between people who are, using them responsibly, whether for recreation, or those who are using them responsibly and commercially, and those who are the minority who are using them irresponsibly. I was called by a reporter last week. They said they expect 1 million of these toy drones to sell for Christmas this year. 1 million. How many of those 1 million people have any idea? Obviously, a lot of them live in restricted airspace, what restricted airspace is, and whether or not they can operate the drone there. I don't think they know. So there also has to be a massive educational campaign, in part, which should be pushed forward and paid for by the manufacturers of these toys who are profiting from their sale. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. They are Michael Whitaker, Deputy Administrator for the Federal Aviation Administration; James Hubbard, Deputy Chief of State Private Forestry for the United States Forest Service; Captain Tim Canal, President of the Airline Pilots Association; Richard Hansen, Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs for the Academy of Model Aeronautics; Dr. Michael Kokendorfer, am I correct there? Doctor, thank you. Professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics at Stanford University. Deputy Administrator Whitaker, you are now recognized for your statement.
Chairman Lobiando, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss.
Excuse me, could you pull your mic a little closer?
I'll scoot closer.
Thank you.
Okay. To discuss the safe operation of unmanned aircraft. The popularity and variety of unmanned aircraft have increased dramatically in recent years. Many commercial uses are becoming commonplace today, including infrastructure inspection, surveying agriculture, and evaluating damage caused by natural disasters. UAS play an increasingly important role in law enforcement, firefighting, and border protection. At the same time, the demand for recreational drones has exceeded anyone's expectations. This demand is driven in large part by individuals who are completely new to the aviation experience. They are not necessarily the traditional model airplane operators, members of local clubs who follow safety guidelines and rules. These new entrants are often unaware that they are operating in shared airspace. The proliferation of small and relatively inexpensive UAS presents a real challenge. To successfully integrate unmanned aircraft into our airspace, we must integrate these new operators into our aviation safety culture. We want people to enjoy this new technology, but we want to make sure they do it safely. This requires education as well as creative and collaborative public outreach. This is why we've joined with our industry partners, including several seated at the table today, to launch the Know Before You Fly campaign. This effort provides UAS operators with the guidance they need to fly safely and is raising awareness of where they can and cannot fly. We also have an ongoing No Drone Zone campaign. This campaign reminds people to leave their unmanned aircraft at home during public events, such as football games, and most recently, the Pope's visit to several major U.S. cities. However, we firmly believe that education and enforcement must go hand in hand. Our preference is for people to voluntarily comply with regulations, but we won't hesitate to take strong enforcement action against anyone who flies an unmanned aircraft in an unsafe or illegal manner. When we identify an operator who endangers other aircraft or people and property on the ground, we will work with our local law enforcement partners to prosecute these activities. To date, the FAA has investigated several hundred incidents of UAS operating outside of existing regulations. Earlier this week, the FAA proposed a $1.9 million civil penalty against a company that knowingly conducted dozens of unauthorized flights over Chicago and New York. This sends a clear message to others who might pose a safety risk. Operate within the law or we will take action. We recognize that the technology associated with unmanned aircraft is continuing to evolve. This is also true for the many technologies that could further advance the safety and capabilities of these aircraft. Earlier today, we announced a research agreement to evaluate technology that identifies unmanned aircraft near airports. Working with our government and industry partners, we will assess this capability in an operational environment without compromising safety. We recognize, too, that our regulatory framework needs to keep pace with technology. The FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 laid out a framework for the safe integration of unmanned aircraft into our airspace. The FAA has taken a number of concrete steps toward accomplishing this goal. A key component of these efforts is finalizing regulations for the use of small unmanned aircraft. Earlier this year, we proposed a rule that would allow small UAS operations that we know are safe. The rule also meets the majority of current commercial demand. The FAA received more than 4,500 public comments on this proposal, and we're working to address those as we finalize the rule. The rulemaking approach we're using seeks to find that balance that you referred to, Mr. Chairman, that allows manufacturers to innovate while mitigating safety risks. We also recognize the need to be flexible and nimble in how we respond to the emerging UAS community. As technologies develop and as operations like beyond line of sight are researched, we want to be able to move quickly to safely integrate these capabilities. While we've made substantial progress on UAS in recent months, we still have more work to do. Recently, the FAA elevated the importance of unmanned aircraft issues within the agency by selecting 2 seasoned executives to oversee our internal and external integration efforts. Major General Mark Gibson, U.S. Air Force retired, and Earl Lawrence, who most recently served as manager of FAA's Small Airplane Directorate. Both of these gentlemen are seated behind me with me today. The FAA has a long history of integrating new users and capabilities into our airspace, and we're well equipped to apply this experience in the area of unmanned aircraft. I'm proud of the team we brought together to accomplish this and of the approach we're taking to ensure America's aviation system remains the safest in the world. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Mr. Hubbard, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The Forest Service, just as a little bit of background of how we get into this, our latest fire season, we responded to 47,000 fires. We had 9 million acres of affected territory. We mobilized 27,000 people with another 5,000 in reserve for initial attack. The future of wildland fire, especially in the West, is probably not going to be much different than that. The vegetative conditions, the drought, and the nature of our forest is going to be prone to this kind of fire for some time to come. Our primary initial attack firefighting tool is aviation. We send air tankers as fast as we can. They don't put fires out, ground troops do, but they're our initial attack response. They also support large fire, and our priority is always life and property, so that gets the most attention. Unmanned aviation systems are also useful to us. In firefighting, they help us with situational awareness, they help us with communication, they help us with monitoring and tracking fire behavior, all safety issues that are valuable. Our challenge is the incursions. I wouldn't say that our statistics are significant compared to everybody else's, but the trend is a little bit worrisome. In 2014, we only had 2 incursions. In 2015, we had 21 incursions. So it's on the rise. 12 of those incursions stopped those initial attack operations. That's not something that we welcome, and it's further complicated because we're talking about aircraft that operate in a complex environment. We're talking about rotary aircraft as well as fixed-wing aircraft over the fire at the same time. We're talking about 150 feet of operational altitude. We're talking about prior to temporary flight restriction. So it's not a simple matter. We don't presume to know how to address this. We rely on the FAA, but the Department of Interior and the Forest Service and the state firefighting organizations all work together with FAA and Homeland Security on the technology and how to work our way through this. In the meantime, public education is important. When we have fire, flames, and smoke in the air, we do get some media attention, and we incorporate into that as a regular message that if you fly, we can't. So trying to get that kind of a word out so people understand. A lot of this is from those who don't understand. So our risk are significant, we believe, if something were to happen in the air with a drone and our aircraft. Our frequency is not that much, but the trend is worrisome. We worry about the risk of identification and avoidance. So a few problems to solve. We also recognize that this is UAS is a valuable tool that we also take advantage of. Be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hubbard. Captain Canal, your statement, please.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiando, Ranking Member Larson, and the subcommittee for the opportunity to be here today. ALPA recognizes that unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS, can allow us to perform certain tasks more efficiently and safely than conventional aircraft. We also understand the value of advancing America's competitiveness in these technologies. That said, ALPA's overarching concern is one of safety. This summer, the FAA released hundreds of pilot reports on UAS sightings. The FAA numbers show more encounters are happening more often. Non-commercial and recreational UAS operations appear to be the primary source. Here are a few examples. Pilots operating an all-cargo flight near San Jose reported a close encounter with a UAS flying 60 to 70 feet to the left of the aircraft. They subsequently described it as four-bladed and X-shaped. As an airline captain, I can tell you, if a pilot is able to report this level of detail, the UAS is way too close. Also, multiple UAS were recently reported by 3 airliners on final approach to Newark Liberty International Airport. In April, a pilot reported a blue metallic drone pass about 100 to 200 feet under the left wing of the airliner arriving at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. For pilots, these UASs literally appear out of the blue. They're much smaller than other aircraft. Some UASs do not have lights. They have limited contrast against visual background, and they move much more slowly than airliners. As a result, these UAS are extremely difficult to see in flight. In this example, you can see how the white color of the UAS blends in with the sky. Imagine trying to detect this UAS while flying at 280 miles an hour. The number of near-miss events that have occurred in such a short period of time demonstrate the risk. The growth in the use of these systems shows the hazards will only increase. The United States must put safety first. The FAA is making progress, but we need to do more. While work on a final rule regarding small commercial UAS operations is encouraging, the agency must immediately address all UAS operations, including recreational and non-commercial. ALPA's recommended action plan has 4 elements. Number 1, education. Anyone who plans to fly these UAS must understand the aircraft, the airspace, and the other aircraft that share it. For those who want to do the right thing, there are resources such as the Know Before You Fly campaign, of which ALPA is a supporter. But we also need to reach, at the point of sale, those individuals who may not yet appreciate the danger. Individuals flying these UASs for recreation must adhere to the FAA guidelines, including any minimum age requirements, maintaining line of sight, and flying under 400 feet. Number 2, registration. Gathering contact information about the UAS purchaser will not only allow authorities to immediately identify the owner, but it will also drive home the serious nature of operating these vehicles. Number 3, technology. If these UAS operate in the airspace intended for airliners, or they could unintentionally end up there, airline pilots need to be able to see them on their cockpit displays, controllers need to be able to see them on their radar scopes, and the UAS must be equipped with active technologies to ensure it is capable of avoiding a collision with manned aircraft. If regulations restrict these UAS from operating in a particular location, the UAS must have technology that cannot be overridden to limit its operations. Penalties for those who deliberately bypass this technology must be significant. Number 4, penalties and enforcement. UAS pilots must be properly trained and understand the consequences of exceeding the operating limitations and the possibility of malfunctions. Anyone deliberately flying a UAS recklessly should be subject to criminal prosecution. Anyone who is operating a UAS and unintentionally deviates from rules and limits should be subject to civil penalty. ALPA welcomes the FAA's recent proposed civil penalty against UAS operator for endangering the safety of the airspace around New York City and Chicago. With this 4-part action plan, our country can capitalize on the economic opportunities offered by these UAS while maintaining safety. Given the safety risks highlighted by the FAA's recent release of pilot reports, ALPA urges Congress to direct the FAA to regulate UAS operated for recreation and hobby. ALPA stands ready to help the FAA develop these regulations as part of realizing our shared goal of ensuring the safety of air transportation for all who depend on it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Captain. Mr. Hansen, you're recognized.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. I'm speaking on behalf of the Academy of Model Aeronautics, the world's largest community-based organization representing more than 180,000 members who fly small unmanned aircraft systems, or model aircraft as we call them, for recreational and educational purposes. For nearly 80 years, AMA has been dedicated to promoting and preserving the hobby of flying model aircraft while ensuring our members adhere to a strict set of community-based safety guidelines. Our National Model Aircraft Safety Code has been recognized by Congress and state legislatures as a safe and effective means of managing hobbyists. These guidelines have evolved to accommodate new technologies, new modeling disciplines, and most recently address the personal use of small UAS. Our membership is a cross-section of America. It's a diverse community of youth and adult that range from the ages of 6 to 96. As you know, there's an unprecedented growth in the industry. According to the Consumer Electronics Association, sales in the U.S. this year will reach 700,000. The growth of the technology in the supporting industry is exciting and is beneficial to our economy and to our society. But as with any emerging technology, there are policy considerations, such as balancing safety, sustaining industry growth, and capturing the public benefits. Before I touch on these points, I want to take a step back and discuss the current landscape. We have been very concerned about recent headlines that portray drones as clogging U.S. airspace, snarling air traffic, and giving the FAA fits. That's why the AMA closely analyzed the 764 records of drone sightings released by the FAA this summer. Our analysis reveals a more complex picture than headlines would suggest. Indisputably, there are some records of near misses that represent actual safety concerns, and more needs to be done to address those. But we found that the number of near misses appears to be in the dozens, not in the hundreds, based on explicit notations in the FAA records. Some of the most serious incidents include 2 actual crashes involving government-authorized military drones. There are also sightings of public entities and commercial operators that may be flying with or without authorization. And the most recent sighting or incident where the FAA has assessed a fine to a commercial operator indicates that the operations occurring in our airspace go well beyond hobbyist activity. And others may not even be drones, but rather balloons, birds, model rockets, and mini blimps. There's some useful information in the FAA's data set, but this data is only helpful if the FAA, the media, and others take the time to analyze and accurately categorize it. AMA has worked closely with the FAA for many years, and we are committed to a continued partnership to promote model aircraft and consumer drone safety. And while the FAA needs to do a better job of presenting the data, AMA has several recommendations to ensure the safety of our nation's airspace. One of the most immediate and helpful things the FAA can do is to increase safety is to finalize and implement its small UAS rules. As they are currently written, the proposed rule will enhance safety by requiring everyone who wants to fly to either participate in the safety programming of a community-based organization like AMA or follow new FAA rules for operators for commercial purposes. Once implemented, the new rules will help provide oversight and education for the UAS operators. At the same time, the FAA should step up enforcement, as they are currently demonstrating, and work more closely with local law enforcement to pursue bad actors. There are existing federal prohibitions against careless and reckless operations, and many jurisdictions have criminal laws in place. In addition, promoting safety through education is another important step we can all take. AMA members know where and where not to fly, and do so safely and responsibly. Unfortunately, many newcomers to UAS may not be aware of these safety considerations. That's why the AMA, in partnership with the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International and the FAA, launched the Know Before You Fly campaign during the last holiday season. Unmanned aircraft systems are going to be a reality within our communities, and it is a community approach that is going to best address that. This new campaign works to put important safety information and flying tips in the hands of the newcomers. Many organizations from the manned and unmanned communities have joined the campaign, including the Airline Pilots Association that's here with us today. Finally, it's been suggested that technology itself can be the solution, and to the industry's credit, many of the leading companies that manufacture UAS for both commercial and recreational purposes have developed and implemented technologies that address some of the concerns. While technology can be a useful tool for situational awareness, it's no substitute for education. In the aviation world, there's a long-standing tradition of putting the responsibility for safety in the hands of the pilot and the person operating the aircraft. I thank you again for this opportunity to participate, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen. Dr. Kokendorfer.
Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. I'm a professor in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at Stanford University, and I'm a third-generation pilot. My research for nearly 10 years has involved statistical estimation of risk and the development of technology for enhancing aviation safety. Personally, I find the rapid acceleration of unmanned aircraft technology to be the most exciting recent development in the field of aeronautics. The proliferation of unmanned aircraft has made aviation accessible and inspired a generation of eager university students in a way that we haven't seen for a long time. The growing popularity of these vehicles has also raised concern about safety. So how do we go about measuring and analyzing these risks? To answer this, we must understand that risk is determined by both the likelihood and the severity of different hazards. First, let us consider severity. A sufficiently large drone can damage any part of an aircraft, but one of the most severe hazards is engine ingestion. The U.S. Airways flight in 2009 was struck by multiple Canada geese. Of course, a flock of sufficiently large drones could cause similar damage. However, flocks of drones are rare, and most consumer drones, just like the DJI Phantom, are less than a third of the weight of a Canada goose. I'm not aware of any engine ingestion testing of the Phantom, but it is certainly conceivable that it would cause some degree of damage to an engine, but probably not of the severity that occurred with a U.S. Airways flight. What is the likelihood of a mid-air collision involving a drone? In order for a collision to occur, the drone has to be at the same altitude and the same geographic location as another aircraft. An analysis of radar data indicates that there are large areas of the country where the risk of encountering another aircraft is negligible. However, there are portions of the airspace where the likelihood of a collision is orders of magnitude more significant. There are several technologies that can help mitigate risk. Altitude limits can be implemented fairly reliably and only require a barometric altimeter. Implementing geofencing is more difficult because it relies on an up-to-date database of geofence locations and accurate GPS location. But the safety risk can be significantly reduced with such technology. I'm not a policymaker, but I believe that it would be wise to set altitude limits for drones capable of flying above 400 feet. The cost to add this safety feature, if it doesn't already exist, is fairly negligible. Most drones capable of flying above 400 feet already have an altimeter. One of the first things a new user might do after opening the box is to see how high the drone can go. This altitude limit would not ensure safety or prevent interference with firefighting on its own, but it will certainly help naive users and discourage reckless users. Preventing a conscientious user, like a firefighter, from overriding an altitude limit is problematic. The exact approach for overriding limits is still being thought through by industry, and I believe it is too early to mandate a particular mechanism. Altitude limitations and geofences are near-term risk mitigation measures, but it is becoming clear that some kind of infrastructure is needed to facilitate the integration of commercial drones into the airspace. NASA Ames, in collaboration with industry and academia, has been pursuing the development of the UAS traffic management system. However, there is still tremendous research to be done. When flying in the same airspace as manned aircraft, a sense and avoid system is likely to be necessary to help prevent collision. The FAA has successfully flight tested the ACAS-X system for large drones, and some of the technology may extend to smaller drones. In conclusion, the growing popularity of commercially available drones presents a risk that should not be ignored. Education should play a major role in risk reduction. In addition, there are technologies that can be easily implemented by manufacturers to help prevent inadvertent airspace violations. It is in the interest of the drone industry to implement these safety measures. It is in the interest of our nation to support the research needed to ensure aviation safety as our technology evolves. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Whitaker, in addressing illegal UAS flights, do you feel there are any additional authorities that the FAA believes Congress can or should provide to curtail or penalize wrongful operation of UAS?
We're currently doing a review of our authorities internally with DOT and also with other agencies. But one of the challenges with this issue is actually locating the UAS operators. It's less a question of authority or magnitude of penalties as it is actually locating the operators. If you look at these pilot reports, they tell us where the UAS is, but they don't tell us where the operator is. If you contrast that with laser strikes, that the pilot usually knows exactly where that strike is coming from. So one of the biggest challenges we're having is locating the operators in the first place, which is why our emphasis has been on education and beefing up that methodology.
And also for you, Mr. Whitaker, according to news reports, government agencies and private companies have acquired and deployed drone detection systems that utilize some combination of radio frequency, thermal detection, video and audio technology that can immediately locate the UAS and its operator. Is the FAA considering similar detection technologies as part of the agency's efforts to mitigate the risk of a mid-air collision between UAS and manned aircraft?
We announced today a new research partnership that goes just to that issue, that deploys a technology at airports that allows you to survey the area within 5 miles of the airport and detect radio signals from UAS. So that technology is going into testing, and it's one of a variety of technologies that we're looking for to detect drones in the airport environment.
So you'll assess the two testing programs to determine how you proceed from there?
We will assess the results of that technology as well as geofencing and some other technologies to try to develop an approach, again, in conjunction with other agencies that have a security issue involved here as well.
So the pilot programs that you announced today, can you give us any timelines on these of when they will be operational at those locations?
The technology is an existing technology, so there hasn't been an announcement of location or time frame yet, but that should be coming shortly.
Okay. Mr. Larson.
Mr. Whitaker, in previous meetings I've had within the office, from private industry, technology folks have suggested to me that they require registration of the product that the individuals purchased, and then share that information with the FAA as a way to track or have a database where you can track use in the event of a violation. Have you heard that from private industry?
We have a number of initiatives that private industry has put forth to help in this effort, including informational paperwork in the packaging itself. The Secretary himself has indicated that he thinks registration may be one of the answers to part of this problem, and we are evaluating that as an option for all UAS.
Yeah, in conjunction with private industry, because most times when you buy a piece of technology these days, anyway, or if you buy a toaster, you register your product online for warranty purposes, as a for instance. So people do this all the time. But
yeah,
the concept that you would then share that would be shared though with an agency might cause some caution. But this is an idea that's coming out of private industry.
And I think we would have to work closely with industry to decide the best way forward for that. We would not be set up to take this level of registration data, and we want to make sure it's accessible if we do that, and also that it can be used for law enforcement purposes.
Right, right. Can you talk a little more about coordination between agencies, maybe with USFS, or an example happened in my district, we have orca pods in the Puget Sound and the San Juan Islands. They're a big driver of tourism, of the tourism economy up there, but people have to comply with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. U.S. Fish and Wildlife fined an aerial photographer for violating the MMPA, that is getting too close to the orca pods, which then he put this aerial photography and video up on his website to advertise himself, basically showing everyone how he violated the MMPA, and then was fined for that. Is that something that runs across your desk, FAA, or can you talk a little bit about how you coordinate with agencies?
We have a large number of ways that we coordinate. Under the DoD authorization, there's an XCOM that meets on UAS that includes DHS, DoD, FAA, and NASA. We have an interagency group that meets quarterly that includes those agencies plus Commerce and others to talk about NextGen as well as UAS. We have a facility that we run at headquarters that's 24/7 monitoring of events in the NAS, and we coordinate with law enforcement agencies through that. And DHS has taken the lead on security issues focused on the Capitol, but also airport environments. And they run that, and we participate in that. So there are really a huge number of fora that we participate in to have that interagency coordination.
Yeah, good. Mr. Hansen, I've had a chance to meet a couple of members. Your District 9 VP is Chuck Bauer, and then Ken Woblik is the president of the Whidbey Island radio control folks there, and they've attended a few town halls, so I want to commend you on your grassroots organizing on this issue. But on that perspective, from a local perspective, how would your members look at registration of UAS purchases, and and using that as a database for enforcement in the event of an incursion, a potential violation.
Well, I believe our members understand that registration at some level certainly makes sense. And I think it needs to be understood that there's a broad spectrum of platforms that are being called drones.
Right.
And the vast majority, I'm going to guess somewhere around 2/3 of the numbers that we've been hearing today are really what we would put in the toy category.
Yeah.
They have a very short lifespan, and they have limited ability to accommodate the type of technology that we're talking about. So as long as we're identifying the proper threshold where registration starts to make sense, I think they'd be very acceptant of that. It's also important to know that they're used to a similar type of process within our community. Every member is required to put their AMA number or their name and address within their aircraft. That's for a number of reasons. Hopefully, if it gets lost, we're hoping somebody will return it to us. But beyond that, it also helps identify the owner-operator for accountability purposes.
Yeah, I'll just end on that point. I was noting yesterday with staff that crabbing industry is big in Washington State as well, and you've got to put your name and address and a contact number on your crab pot buoy in case it gets loose or in case someone steals it. But you have to do this because you need to be held accountable, and so it's the same kind of deal. Yes, Mr. Lobiondo, did you have a question for me?
You could have drones monitor the crab pots.
That's next.
That's next. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member holding this hearing. You know, the University of Alaska in Fairbanks has been named one of the designated area test sites for the UASs. But the frustration they have is the certification of authority process, as Mr. Whitaker. Is the FAA doing anything to shorten this process? They've been granted, but it takes a long, long time. Why does it take that long, or are you improving that time factor?
We are, sir, we've taken several steps. With respect to the test sites, we initially issued a blanket certificate of authorization for operations up to 200 feet. We recently, last month, increased that to 400 feet. So that really streamlines the paperwork process pretty dramatically. There may still be some exemption requirements, but they should be much fewer now. And the exemption process itself we have streamlined, but we do a safety analysis on each of the applications, so that does take some time, but it should be much more streamlined now.
Well, they're very complimentary to your efforts, but they just want to expedite the process. Now it's taking a year, 2 years sometimes, and we need to solve that problem. That's number one.
Yeah, most of the applications have been eliminated now for the test sites, but when they do come, they should be measured in days, certainly not months or years.
Captain, what kind of equipment do you have in your aircraft for avoidance, collision avoidance? You say you can't, you know, if you have to look for this drone, don't you have equipment on the airplane that can identify a object in front of you quicker than just by eyesight?
So as demonstrated by the video, visual acquisition is very, very difficult in any aircraft.
Even with a radar system, the collision avoidance?
Well, we do have terminal collision avoidance systems in the aircraft, commonly referred to as TCAS, but they're equipped to operate and to highlight other aircraft who are similarly equipped. So if the unmanned aerial system does not have a transponder on it, S-coded transponder, or isn't ADS-B equipped, it will not show up on our displays in the cockpit at all.
Mr. Hansen, how did you get in such a good position as far as model airplanes? I mean, for a while you were under attack. I remember that when I was chairman of this committee. Now, how did you achieve that? What can they do in this unmanned aircraft to make that same strides forward?
Well, I think the significant differentiation between our community and this newer community of users is the approach that we take to the hobby. I mean, people get into this hobby, at least traditionally, because of their interest in aviation and their interest in learning how to build, fly, and operate their aircraft. The newer communities are attracted more by the technology and the functionality of the aircraft, something it can do, such as taking pictures. In some cases, it's not different from the smartphone. I mean, they look at it as just an extension of your camera. So we have a different mindset within this community, but in our opinion, it does all boil down to an educational process, that as long as they understand the means by which they can operate safely and responsibly, we believe that the American citizen will do that. Not to say there aren't those individuals out there that will deliberately act irresponsibly, but until we can assuredly say that the consumer has that information in hand, it's a little hard to assess the mentality and the deliberate acts of the others.
Right. Doctor, technology, you're an expert in that arena, a pilot. What would happen if we required the manufacturers to put a kill button in the unmanaged aircraft if they got within certain many feet of an airport? That's really what we're here for. The danger to the airplane that's flying, the pilot's flying. Could there be technology that way? Because most of these are battery operated, is that correct? Very few of them are run by fossil fuels.
Yeah, I would say the majority of the 700,000 or so that will be coming out are battery powered.
Could you build, could there such a thing as you're talking, it's sort of like an electric fence or something. I was driving a golf cart the other day, and you can't go close to the green because they have this communication that stops the golf court. So why couldn't the technology be applied to any of these hobby drones where the thing dies?
I think that's what they're aiming at with geofencing, but you probably don't want it to die completely because then it'll fall out of the air and maybe hurt someone.
Well, you lose your drone, you won't do it
yeah.
again, I guarantee. But I'm just looking at the technology, and Mr. Chairman, if I may say, you at this table help us write this legislation. Because when we write legislation, 99% of the time it's screwed up. They don't really understand the problem is get input from those people directly involved, the airline, the FAA, the government agencies, and those that have knowledge in how it works. So we have to use your input, Mr. Chairman. And I say this from experience of 44 years, and most of this legislation we've written doesn't work, and then when the regulations come in and we're all screwed up. So I'm just suggesting we use this expertise to solve this problem of danger. That's really what we're here for. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was pleased to read that the FAA is going ahead with CACI. I met with them earlier, and they were going to test their technology in Virginia this summer. It's been used in military applications. As they explained it to me, they can pinpoint the operator. That's good. They can do numerous things. They can force the drone to land. They can force it to go back to the operator, or in the case of hostiles, they deliver something to the operator. So the question, would be, how quickly are we going to move ahead with this? I'm very disturbed at the 24 incursions on fires. How many of those people were prosecuted or were even identified?
I don't have statistics on how many, but as I said before, it's very, very difficult to track them down just by the nature of the UAS operation.
Right. So, and what about registration? You've heard that mentioned. You said you couldn't handle the volume. I mean, we just talk about an online database or something. What's the barrier to requiring registration?
Well, there's interagency discussion going on about how that would be used and what the logistics of it would be, what would be the best tool for that, whether it's at point of sale, how you verify ID, things of that nature. So there's some digging into the technicalities of that's going on now.
Well, I would hope that doesn't take too long. I mean, I identified that one case in my hometown where the police would really like to know who the peeping Tom was operating that drone, but we'll never know. And Mr. Young mentioned the idea that you wouldn't want to necessarily disable them and have them drop out of the sky, but they can also direct them to another place. And if we had designated safe sites around airports or critical airspace, and we use this technology, we could direct the drones there and say, oh, come get your drone. We'll be waiting. This is a very, very, I've been through almost 29 years in this committee, and we used to talk about the tombstone mentality at the FAA. And, I'm very concerned about what this means to the safe operation of civil aviation in this country. And beyond that, I'm particularly concerned that it will also bring to a halt the legitimate commercial development of drones. I mean, we take down one plane with one of these toys that someone's operating irresponsibly or a terrorist uses, this industry is going to grind to a halt altogether. We need to get a handle on this quickly. Captain, do you have anything you want to add? Because, I mean, it was, Mr. Hansen, I'm sympathetic to the model folks. I used to build those things out of balsa wood with the little piston engines that didn't work very well and all that stuff. So I know that whole area, but we're talking about a whole new generation of people. The same people who the words cell phone and etiquette don't go together are now getting their hands on these drones. And I'm worried about responsible operation. Captain?
No, I agree, and to differentiate, I thought it was an important point Mr. Hansen made about his members who I generally believe are responsible operators, and those who are not part of his community who are operating these vehicles. They do have batteries in them, and these are dense, heavy metal pieces that will wreak havoc on aircraft. When it hits a transport category aircraft, when it hits one, there's going to be a significant event. Whether it hits the windscreen, some piece of the flight control system, or is ingested in the engine, this is going to be a significant event. And for the flight crew, it's going to be a very challenging event to save the aircraft.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on that?
It's not my intent to scare anybody here today,
No.
but it is a significant event. Okay, so an accident is never the result of a single episode. You can't point to any particular accident and say that was the sole cause of that accident, and I believe this is the same thing. But we look at all the risks that we deal with in commercial aviation on a day-to-day basis, and we have to assign risk to each element of it: weather, traffic, communications, security within the cockpit, cybersecurity. We look for mitigations on every single element of that risk. This is another element to the risk chain. And should it happen at a time when something else is going wrong, we're already dealing with a possible flight control malfunction or a challenging communications or weather situation, and then we hit the drone in some sort of, and always in a critical phase of flight, down below 10,000 feet, which is the highest likelihood of contact, that's when we have the highest risk of an actual accident. And, I think if you can't point to a single solution to this problem, it has to be a layered effect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Peter. Mr. Micah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Mr. Whitaker, what's today's date?
Sir, it's the 7th of October,
What year?
2015.
And the legislation that we passed
No, he's going to ask him.
in 2012, the FAA Modernization Reform Act, had a directive to FAA, and what deadline did it set for you to finish the work that was assigned in the law on drones?
September 2015, sir.
So we are behind schedule, obviously. If you review the record, when we passed this in 2012, and I believe that was February, was it, staff? Yes. By next year, 2013, you had completed the plan that's also required under the law, which is a good step. You didn't propose the rule until January 20th of this year, right?
That's correct, sir.
And you've had, and the rule came out in February. So you've had February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, we're just into October. So you've had 8 months to finalize that rule. And now you're saying that, and the rule, does the real rule just deal with the small aircraft?
Small UAS under 55 pounds.
Under 55 pounds. Because I think we allowed a differentiation between small and large. And you, at least the testimony I've heard is sometime in 2016. Can you be more specific with sometime?
So the comment period was open until April of this year. We've had over 4,500 comments.
But the sometime in 2016.
And we're adjudicating those comments, and our internal objective is to get the rule out of FAA by the end of this year. Then it will go through the review process at DOT and OMB. Last time you and I discussed this.
February, March, April?
Last time you and I discussed the point, we agreed on the date of June 17th, and I think that's still a solid date, and we should be able to beat that.
So not till next June?
It should be in the first half of next year.
And what about large?
So the development of large UAS integration is going to depend in large part on commercial demand and also in large part on technology. So that will develop as the technology develops and the demand develops.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I'm disappointed. What will probably propel this, maybe actually propel your schedule, is going to be a very serious accident and incident. I can almost predict there will be one. There are just so many of these now flying that it's almost inevitable that we have a drone hit an aircraft, and there will be probably injuries and hopefully not fatalities. And these drones are up to 55 pounds. I remember going to a testing center when they would throw like a 40-pound frozen bird or something into an aircraft engine, and I saw what that did. These can do as much damage, and I don't need another test to show what would happen, but it probably will happen. Maybe that will speed things up. You've had how many incidents? You said aircraft was with drones that were somewhat serious. Is it 200, 400? Captain Carroll, do you know?
So we don't keep the records at the airline.
Okay, FAA, do you know? How many have you had reported?
We're at a rate of about 100 a month of pilot reports.
100 a month. That's 1,200 a year. And so far you've cited about 20, there's been about 20 enforcement actions. Did I hear that?
That involve civil penalties, yes.
That seems very low. The other thing, too, is in your plan, and I haven't reviewed all, the pending rule, do you have a provision for requiring, and maybe you can't do this, maybe we have to do it by law, but hundreds of thousands of these are being sold. A simple warning that says that you can't fly this within so close to an airport at such a height. That's not on the required now on the sale of the unit. Is it in your proposal, and can you do that, or should we do that by law? Because I think just letting people know when they purchase one of these what their obligations are is important.
We've been working with manufacturers to have information put in the package.
Is it in your rule, proposed rule?
The proposed rule deals with commercial operations, and the issue is really the amateur operators. So we've been working with manufacturers to have the information voluntarily included, and an increasing number are doing that now, but we would have to have a rule to mandate it, which A, we're not authorized to do, and B, would take too long. So our focus is
possibly
voluntary.
A law. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Hansen. In your statement, you disagree with the FAA regarding the number of UAS near-miss reports with the FAA that are received by the FAA. Does AMA have a data collection and analysis program underway to collect near-miss reports from UAS users or airline pilots? And how does AMA substantiate your statement that the number of reports are actually much lower?
No, ma'am. AMA does not collect that data. We use FAA's list of pilot-reported and individually reported sightings of unmanned aircraft. And I think it's important to note that they didn't classify all of those as being what is termed near misses or near mid-air collision. They were termed, a very subjective term, as being close calls. And again, that is subjective and undefined. And to my knowledge, the FAA currently does not have a defined definition or a definitive definition of a near miss of a manned aircraft with an unmanned aircraft. So what we did in our analysis was to go strictly to the language in the sighting itself and only pulled out those ones or looked at those ones where the person reporting the sighting in their determination called it either a near miss or indicated they had to take some type of evasive action. Quite honestly, there's a large number of the sightings in there that couldn't even be termed near encounter of any kind because it wasn't even identified clearly as being an aircraft.
Do you have a suggestion for a definition of near miss then that should be standardized?
Well, if we're talking about a near miss between an unmanned aircraft and a manned aircraft, I believe that before you create that definition, you'll need to do some analysis of the environment that they operate in and the types of vehicles that we're talking about. As the captain cited, that we're talking about very slow-moving, very small objects that, when seen from the cockpit, it's very difficult to give it any type of relative value in terms of size, speed, and even its intentions in terms of where it's going to fly. So I think there needs to be some study done in terms of what actually would constitute a near miss, and that's probably more from the perspective of the pilot in terms of when and where and how he would be able to identify that object and to appropriately take action to make sure there's not any type of airspace conflict.
I would agree with you. If we're going to develop some common sense policy out of this committee, we need to have good data upon which to do that. So thank you for your suggestion. My next question is for Mr. Hubbard. Mr. Hubbard, I represent one of the most forested districts in the country. Although it isn't in Arizona, people don't think of Arizona as having that much forest. I'm sure you're very familiar with the horrific wildfires we have, and we're really trying to do something with prevention. And so my question is a little bit different from just suppression. You know, what's the opportunity to use drones in fire prevention and in healthy forests?
They're very useful in terms of collecting the information and what we are dealing with on the land. So that kind of overflight to give us a good assessment of what's out there without taking all the time and expense to go find out on the ground is very helpful to us.
And then specifically back to suppression, how do you intend to use UAS in fire suppression efforts?
Well, primarily the situational awareness, keeping track of what's going on, where our crews are on the ground, how the fire is behaving, and making sure that nobody's in harm's way unnecessarily, and that we can have the right kind of communications with those crews in case they need to move and move quickly. It gives us a lot of advance warning.
You know, we had a tragic situation with the Yarnell fire where our firefighting crew did not know the direction of that fire, and it changed dramatically from what was being expected. Would UAS have been helpful to prevent that tragedy?
That's a difficult one to say. I would have liked to have had it available.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keno, you're talking about the need to register drones and enforcement and all. Would that be all drones, or is there some size limit or some cutoff point in which you ought to be able to have a toy drone without having to turn your identity over to the federal government?
So it's an interesting question, and the way we approach it is more or less analyzing the capabilities of the vehicle vis-a-vis altitude, range, speed, to see if they could actually end up in airspace shared with airliners.
Right, like I can go on Amazon,
right,
and this is the best-selling UAV, I guess they have.
Yeah. It's
$45.90. I can have it by Friday because I'm an Amazon Prime member for free shipping. But the shipping weight is 1.1 pound,
right,
and it has a range of 50 meters. I mean, that's 165 feet. You're surely not saying that needs to be registered.
If it can fly to 1,500, 2,000 feet, yes, sir.
But if it only has a range of 50 meters, it's only going to get 165 feet. So you're okay there.
I'm not sure if that range is being expressed as a lateral range or if that's the transmitter range or the actual physical capability following lost link at full throttle. Would it just continue to climb to 2,000, 3,000 feet?
Okay, and Let's go over to the FAA. Mr. Whitaker, I've spoken to some folks in the UAV industry who have actually expressed an interest in working with y'all on geofencing. Is there any way right now a UAV manufacturer can get a list of restricted airspace in a machine-readable format that they could integrate into their system?
All of the information about airport airspace and restricted airspace is publicly available and is pushed out as part of the data that comes from FAA. And some of the manufacturers have already started to include geofencing technology in their products.
So so you're saying there is a standardized database that's updated regularly? I guess it's your notice to airmen.
Yeah, the charts are updated about every 2 months, sort of in a formal structure, and then in the interim, there are NOTAMs that are put out to give interim updates.
And do you have any idea so y'all are able to get that computerized, yet you're talking about the inability to keep a database of registered owners. I mean, that seems pretty simple: name, address, manufacturer, model, and serial number. I mean, I could probably code that, before we finish lunch.
Yes, sir, and then we need to verify that the person's name is the person who's actually registering it, which creates some of the complication.
All right, and let's talk a little bit about, is there a way to integrate these affordably into the air traffic control system by putting some transponder or something on there where the air traffic controllers or the ADSB in moving aircraft can see them? Again, as this technology moves, it seems like you ought to be able to get that basically on a chip.
So with respect to amateur use, we really want to keep them out of the controlled airspace, if you will. So we want to keep them away from airports and under 400 feet, or with the case of the small UAS rule, under 500 feet. I think there still is a question whether they shouldn't also be equipped with something that has a radio signal that allows us to track them otherwise. When you get to the larger UAS, anything that operates in the controlled airspace would have to be equipped with ADSB, the same as an aircraft would after 2020. But certainly that is going to be necessary to have any kind of integration in the larger UAS.
All right, so finally, let's talk for just 1 second about the difference between recreational users and commercial users. A lot of the recreational users like to stick a GoPro or some sort of camera on their drone. You then upload that to YouTube, and YouTube sells ads on. I mean, where do you cross the line into commercial use and private use?
Well, I don't think the example you raised indicates commercial use. I think that's a pretty common use of recreational drones. Commercial use is if you're being paid to operate, or if it's being operated as part of your business model.
All right, I can just see there being, being some potential gray areas there.
Always are. Yeah.
My kids put a lemonade stand up, and they post a video shot with a UAV of them selling lemonade at their lemonade stand. You potentially cross that line. So I would just, my point is, and I would urge a light touch there for recreational users who really aren't being reckless. And obviously a lot of details there, and hopefully that's what some of your test centers that you're partnering with universities and the rulemaking processes are. But we've got to find the right balance between moving quickly but not over-regulating and killing a future industry. I see my time's expired. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitaker, in my congressional district in Ventura County in California, the Sheriff's Department is the only public agency that currently uses UAS aside from the Navy. We have a big naval base there and future home of the Triton on the West Coast. But the Sheriff's Department has received a certificate of authorization to operate the device. They use it primarily for search and rescue. We have mountains in the district, so it's very helpful from that perspective. But every time the Sheriff's Office operates, they notify the nearby FAA air traffic control towers, and they also file a notice to airmen. And as I understand it, that's not required, but they do it they take this step out of an abundance of caution. Is that something that the FAA might consider in their rule in terms of a requirement that people who are operating UASs would have to do on a commercial basis, obviously.
Yeah, the public use UAS are really quite mature and operate in several ways that the small UAS won't be able to initially operate. The NOTAM system, I think, is an interim step to getting us to a more real-time ability to notify other users of the system. But that is, I think, the appropriate procedures at this time.
So I wanted to ask a little bit more on the COAs. I think I read in the documents that there's close to 1,700 or so COAs that have been given. So what is the what's your backlog right now? What's the current demand?
I'm not sure what the actual backlog is. I can get that information for you. We have increased our throughput fairly dramatically so that we're doing over 100 a week now. So we've cleared a lot of the backlog, but they're also coming in at a pretty good clip. So we can get those numbers to you.
So do you have any idea of how many UASs are being operated without a COA? Again, commercial applications.
We don't have a way of knowing that exactly. The indications that we're getting from pilot reports gives us some glimpse into what's happening without authorization, but the numbers are too big for us to track, and we don't have those resources.
And you said that you've now, for UASs over 400 feet, or I guess over 400 feet or under 400 feet,
so
it's a standard
For the
contract.
model, it's 400, and for under the small rule, it'll be 500 and below.
And so can you give me a sense of how many of these COAs that you're involved in negotiating a special contract for a specific use?
So we try to group the COAs as much as possible to expedite the processing. There have been 1,800 so far on the commercial side, and literally thousands on the public use side. So these vehicles are actually in pretty widespread use now.
And you said only 20 or so civil penalties have been.
We've had several hundred investigations. Under our compliance policy, our first preference is to get people operating in accordance with the rules, and if we don't have to use enforcement, we don't use enforcement. There have been over 20 cases now that have required us to issue civil penalties.
And what do those civil penalties look like? I mean, what can you describe?
So the baseline is up to $25,000 per incident. In the case of the penalty that went out yesterday, it was $1.9 million. It involved dozens and dozens of flights over a heavily populated area.
So in terms of wildfire suppression and the use of UASs, does the FAA have any specific legislative recommendations to improve the FAA enforcement authority or to increase criminal or civil penalties for interference with wildlife?
We're evaluating with other agencies the level of the penalties involved. Right now, it's $25,000 on the civil side, up to $250,000 and 20 years in prison on the criminal side. That level is being evaluated interagency. The biggest challenge we have, we think the most bang for the buck comes from education, because a lot of the operations are inadvertent. And on the enforcement side, the real challenge is how we locate the operators of the vehicle.
And on the education piece, in terms of know before you fly, the educational program materials, is there any legal barrier that prevents the FAA from requiring manufacturers to include the safety information and packaging?
We're prohibited from regulating for recreational use drones. It's possible that we could do a rulemaking around that, but the time frame of rulemakings is such it's not a particularly viable tool for us. So we're very much focused on voluntary compliance at this point.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Hanna.
Thank you. As a pilot and someone who represents Griffiths Air Force Base, one of the 6 sites selected, I'd suggest that there's more unanimity amongst you today than I've heard in a long time. One of the problems is that we are probably a severe accident away from a public hue and cry over why haven't we done something, whereas as Mr. Micah kind of implied or said directly, Mr. Whittaker's off schedule, to be polite, and I would suggest there's urgency to this, as you know. Mr. Knoll you'd have to agree that we're one accident away, I imagine, from something that people can't imagine that would create havoc and be a rush to judgment about a whole lot of things that would affect Mr. Hansen's people. I have an 8-year-old son who owns 3 of these. If I bought him 4 more tomorrow, they'd be wrecked by tomorrow night. They don't survive well. They're small. But, and I don't see, I would say that notice to airmen are really give the assumption that people have perfect information, that people call, investigate, do their homework. And I know as a pilot, people do not. I want to ask him, Mr. Knoll, it's my kind of unconsidered opinion that these things do not belong near airports. And to that end, Mr. Hansen and Mr. Knoll, what kind of, and you've talked a lot about this in your statement, Mr. Knoll, is what kind of training do you think is appropriate that would, for the people that are flying these larger ones, or anyone, if you will, that you would like to see?
Well, if the vehicle is intended to be operated in shared airspace, then I think the standard is very close to established, if not already established. And it exists for us as a pilot to complete our training, our recurrent training, and maintain all our qualifications. If the vehicle isn't intended to operate in the airspace, then it's a matter of putting proper mitigations to keep it out of the airspace, be it from lost link, so the vehicle just doesn't fly off, or from unintentional blunders into the airspace. And that's the importance of the educational campaign that we all agree on up here. One element of the educational campaign is we should consider testing, where someone goes online, reads the materials, and takes a little test that satisfies the parents that the child knows how to operate the vehicle.
What do you think about that, Mr. Hansen? I mean, would you rather just stay out of airspace, pick a distance for different A, B, C, or whatever? You're not going to be in A airspace, but C or B airspace. Do you accept what Mr. Knoll said, that you don't have, you should be in a, you should have commercial training or training as if a pilot to fly in airspace that may have at low ground levels near an airport? What do you think of that?
I think we take a little different approach to it. I mean, we consider all airspace shared airspace. I mean, the FAA claims their authority down to within 1 inch of the ground. So we instruct our pilots, and our educational program is based upon the fact that there's always the possibility of encountering a manned aircraft in that airspace, and we're to take every steps necessary to not interfere with manned.
But you'd have to admit that there's a lot more likelihood if you're on an airport than if you're not.
Sure, and as we talk about flying in closer proximity to an airport, then we have other procedures that we put in place. But the primary safety tenets is to not interfere and to see and avoid at all times. And we have a very instructional document that talks about how model aircraft operators should see and avoid. And to the credit to the model aircraft community, there have not been significant airspace conflicts between true model aircraft and
let me ask you this, so why is it important that you operate in the same airspace that would be an airport? Why does that drive, what drives you to think that? And I'm not saying you don't have a right to that. I'm just curious why that's important.
I think it goes to the point that not all airports are created equal. We have a lot of very rural airports that have low traffic counts, that are in communities where they're welcome to operate. We actually have clubs that are co-located on airports at general.
I've seen many of them,
airports, and they have coordinating procedures that allow them to operate safely.
So then, implying from that, you might, that would suggest to me that there are places where you would say you shouldn't be, maybe C and B space, to the ground, and places where you could, where that's just general space in a grass strip in the middle of Cooperstown, New York, where I happen to fly out of once in a while.
Well, there's no doubt there are locations where these types of devices shouldn't be flown. It's not an easy answer to say that you can't fly C, D, or B.
But I guess what I'm suggesting is that you have a lot in common here, and rather than fight for something that's not reasonable, you may want to think about what's really important to the people who operate these things for agriculture and recreation at the types of airports that you just described. Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, thank you for the hearing, a very, very important one. Mr. Larson, you opened the issue of registration, and Mr. Fahrenholtz picked it up, and he mentioned picking up his smartphone and Amazon. It's registered. And most everything you buy today is registered at least back to the manufacturer in some way or another. It seems to me we don't need a government registration program, but we need the government to be able to access the registration program that the manufacturers probably already have. It'd be very simple to do that. Of course, we could spend several years trying to write a regulation to accomplish that, which is probably what we'll do because that's our specialty. Why don't we just simply say all of these UASs must be registered, held by the manufacturer or the seller of that, and the government has the ability to access that under circumstances relating to an accident or some other incident. Fairly simple, but probably far too simple for our normal work around here. The question was just raised about airspace at an airport. You know, we can go back and forth with trying to define what geofencing is and wait 20 years for some sort of technology to actually work, or we can simply say, hey, if you're flying this UAS near a significant airport, a hub airport or a sub-hub airport, you're violating the law and you're subject to a fine or even jail time. And by the way, if you're flying near an active fire, you're subject to a fine and jail fine. Now that would immediately educate everybody involved in this sport or commercial activity. Now the other way around is study, 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 which is another specialty of the government, or those who don't want any interference by anybody. So anyway, I propose legislation introduced now, today, actually yesterday, that simply says if you're flying a UAS within 2 miles of a significant airport, you are breaking the law, and you're subject to 1 year in jail and a significant fine. And if you're flying near an active fire, you are breaking the law and you're subject to 1 year in jail. Now that's a pretty clear message. So, Mr. Herbert, what do you think of that, since you tend to fight fires?
I think we need some help of some kind because when we're fighting fire, we're very low altitudes and in very complex situations with a lot of distractions, not the least of which is smoke. So the sense and avoid is very difficult. And if the technology isn't there for the sense and avoid, then we have to turn to the education or to the regulation.
Mr. Kennel, Captain.
Yes, sir. I'd love to see it. I can't wait to read it because I think it's a step in the right direction. One concern would be with the limitation of 2 miles, assuming the reference point's in the middle of the airport, the threshold's a mile from that point. The vehicles could be well above me on approach to that airport at that point. 2 miles, I'm approximately 900 feet off the ground from the end of the runway. So I think it should be a little larger than that, especially at some of our larger airports. If you look at Class B airspace around Atlanta and in Miami, drops all the way down to the surface as far as 6-7 miles from the airport. We don't want anyone operating off the surface at all inside Class B airspace unless they're talking to air traffic control and being controlled by air traffic control.
How about our little hobbyist?
Well, it's been a long time since I've been called little, but the devil, I think, is always in the details.
Referring to the machines.
I think the devil is always in the details, and as the captain pointed out, at some airports, 2 miles certainly might not be far enough. Other airports, it may be adequate or maybe even too far. I mean, if you're a homeowner within that distance and you want to buy your, in my case, grandson, one of these toys that can be flown in the backyard, I'd hate to see him subject to a 1 year in jail penalty for flying it in his backyard. So I, like the captain, would be very interested in seeing the language of the proposed bill and having an opportunity to comment on it.
Well, I'll see that you have it in a few moments. You know, we get really tied up in details here, and in the meantime, as one or two of my colleagues have said, a time is going to pass and the accident's going to happen. I would say the incident's going to happen. Not sure it's an accident. but the incident's going to happen. We know that in California we've had numerous fires. We've also known in California that we are now facing a situation where those fires have expanded as a result of drones shutting down the aerial operations. And we've also had more than enough incidents in the airspace around airports, as was testified to. So I think it's time for us simply to lay down a marker here and say, if you are operating a UAS in these spaces, you're violating the law and you're subject to a severe penalty. Now, that's the kind of education program that somebody might pay attention to. And if your grandchildren happen to be near that runway and they're flying their little UAS that you kindly bought them, that is somehow interfering with the approach of the captain into Atlanta Airport, I'm sorry, but the kid's breaking the law, and as a responsible adult, you should also be held accountable. Because we're talking about serious, very serious potential problems. Yield back my time, and I'll deliver a copy of the legislation to you.
Mr. Rikita.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate your testimony. Mr. Whitaker, it seems to me that folks in general aviation could work closely with drone operators and owners to help educate and train on these rules that are forthcoming and different best practices for operations. Have you, as the FAA, reached out to any GA organizations or associations?
I don't have specific examples of that. I agree that that is an important aspect of this. I think one of the things that we are looking at is this question of airspace and how it's defined, because right now the law.
That's not my question.
I'm sorry.
So you think it's a good idea. So you'll commit to reach out?
Yes, sir.
Okay, to who?
To general aviation community.
Like who?
Well, we usually work through AOPA and small airport associations.
It's in your authority to reach out to them?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we'll do that by what date, do you think? And it doesn't just have to be AOPA, but you say it's a good idea. I just want to get you on record when we can start moving to build partnerships where they make most sense. When can you do that by?
If you'd like, I can report back to you within 30 days on our plan to do that.
No, just tell us now when you can make a phone call, when you can write a letter. When can you get these guys involved?
Yeah, in the next 4 weeks.
Great, thank you very much. Depending on the time of year, farmers may be out in the field wanting to use these machines. And in Indiana, there's farm operations 24 hours 7, probably starting right now. Yet I think the proposed rule 107.29 only allows day operations. Are you considering modifying that at all, or are you going to be strict on the day operations? Because I can see in a farm field where it could be these machines can be used all around the clock.
So night operations is one of the areas that is being researched, and it could be allowed by exemption. But as soon as we can find ways to do that safely, that's something we'd like to allow.
Okay. I appreciate that. Captain, thanks for your testimony as well. How do your members know? You talk about these near-miss sightings and these reports of UAS. How do you know it's what they saw versus, a balloon that a kid let go a while ago, which I see in my aircraft from time to time, then I try to do a circle around it, safely, of course. Or even a UFO. You can go on cable at night anywhere from 11 to 3 in the morning and hear all these pilot stories about UFOs. How do we know we saw a UAS, and what specifically does ALPA do to verify the sightings?
So there's a redundant set of eyes in the cockpit, and hopefully both pilots can lay their eyes on the cockpit.
So all these reports are double sightings?
Not always, especially if the aircraft was only down one side of the aircraft for a fleeting moment. You may only get the captain or the first officer's opinion.
Right.
And they're small vehicles, and they're moving quickly. We're moving quickly. They may
as your video depicts, it's hard to see these things. So how are we so sure? I mean, Mr. Whitaker, you were picked on by my good friend John Micah for only having 20 civil penalty cases. But in all fairness, couldn't it be that you couldn't verify that these were even UASs to begin with?
You have to rely on the pilot's opinion of what he saw. We do see a lot of balloons.
The pilots aren't God.
No, sir. No one's asserting
right. So it's not. We shouldn't even necessarily on this panel or in America accept the premise that all these sightings or near-miss UAS sightings are really, in fact, UASs to begin with, should we?
No, sir. Not all of them.
Right.
But many of them are in the
How do you know how
proliferation
many,
of-
though? That's my
I
whole
don't know
point.
how many, sir.
So we
but,
don't
you
even know
there's
how
quite
many.
a few more, and with the proliferation of the expansion, 1 million more of these potentially next year, even if a small percentage of them were UAS, I think we have a problem.
Well, that may be, but we don't know what we're talking about because we can't even quantify it. There's millions of birds, too. Right?
I agree that the
And
fidelity...
that reminds me, Dr. Durfer, you talk about a Canadian geese being so much heavier, and the assumption in your testimony, at least the assumption I took, is that birds are still certainly, or at least potentially, more dangerous. Yet the captain says, well, you know, there's metal batteries in these things and they're dangerous too. Can you elaborate on your testimony?
Yeah, definitely. It depends entirely on the platform. I mean, there are some drones there's one drone that came out last week that can fit on your fingertips and weighs the same as 3 pennies. There are others like the Phantom that's a third the weight of Canada Goose. There are others that have like a 10-foot wingspan and weigh 30 pounds. So it really depends.
Yeah, so you can't quantify it. And
That's
the
right.
time I have remaining, I want to go into the commercial licensing structure. Captain Connell, your organization is recommending a commercial pilot's license, yet the flight characteristics of these drones, the stall characteristics are completely different. I have a commercial license, and it's basically a VFR ticket that's met with higher specifications. I don't understand why we need a commercial license. I'm not getting that, and I'm wanting to assume it's simply because you're worried about job protection. You're worried about the one day that these operators might, or these unmanned vehicles might take away a pilot's job.
No, sir, that's not the concern with commercial operations. Operations for remuneration on all modes of transportation, be it a taxi cab, an airplane, a sea-going vessel, all require commercial operations, and that's the basis of why.
Because it's revenue generating. So, in fact, you're worried about the revenue generating impact of this, not necessarily the safety impact of this as it results.
There's a higher expectation of safety when you pay for a service. Yes, sir, that's the safety element as well.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm not going to say anything you don't already know, so you can go to sleep. It doesn't much matter. But to be perfectly honest, I just got off a plane. If a drone pulls down a plane that I'm on, I guarantee you everybody you represent is going to get sued. And if you put me on a jury on a case like that, you're all going to lose. Because we can do something. Maybe it's not perfect yet. I'm sure it's not, because this is a new and evolving technology. But doing nothing in the face of a clear danger is not an excuse, to be perfectly honest. Getting it right over time, fine. But we should be doing stuff. Putting an educational packet, look, I own 2 drones. They're not really big ones. I haven't got a clue what the heck I'm doing with them either. I really stink at it, which of course is a danger. Now, I don't know about the 2-mile limit on the airport. I live within 2 miles of an airport, and probably a lot of my constituents live a lot closer than that. I don't know. I wouldn't intentionally try to bring down a plane, but Christmas presents, Christmas Day, some kid doing something on a drone you can get out of Brookstone. Nothing special. This is crazy. We can do it in automobiles. We can do it in my phone. If I drop this phone today, right now, some very smart 15-year-old technology kid could figure out where I bought it, who it belongs to, where I was yesterday, who I called, et cetera, et cetera. Yet if it happens to a drone, nobody knows. Well, I saw something, I don't know what it was. Come on. You can put VIN numbers on it. You can put all kinds of wonderful, tiny little technology on it, even in something as small as your finger. And if you can't do it, I can find people who can do it, to be able to track it down. Never mind the regulations. I mean, I'm all for those, thoughtful regulations, thoughtful licensing, not a problem. I'm not trying to shut down the technology at all. I think this technology is opening up a wonderful new frontier, both for hobbyists and for professionals on all kinds of levels. But it also presents a danger. And that danger shouldn't be accepted. And just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do something. So I don't really have any questions, because I know you can do it. I just see a reluctance to do it, especially from the FAA. And I don't understand it. I don't understand it at all. Do something before somebody loses their life on this. I don't want to be here yelling at you for having done nothing. That's no fun. and I certainly don't want to be yelling at you if it's somebody I know and somebody I love, or somebody you know and somebody you love, or somebody in your profession. This is crazy. Just get it done. Now, again, I understand it won't be the last item. I know that this is an evolving thing. I know they're coming up with smaller things and bigger uses. And I'm not so sure about the 2-mile radius, because there are some parts of the 2-mile radius that there's no planes at all. But I also know that there's some places beyond 2 miles that it does. So I'm not sure what the answer is. You guys know it. You already know it. I'm not trying to involve myself or trying to prohibit any hobbyist from doing anything that's reasonable and thoughtful. And I think that 99% of the people who are using these things are well-intended and just might make accidents, but accidents didn't stop us from putting VIN numbers on automobiles, on 15 different places in automobiles. Accidents happen, but there are also some people that are bad people. And if there are bad people out there doing bad things, we haven't done anything that I know of to be able to allow us to find them. If somebody intentionally goes out to Logan Airport tomorrow and sits in East Boston and flies a drone intentionally into a plane to kill somebody, we have allowed the technology to not exist, and it exists easily, to not be able to find that perpetrator. So you can have all the criminal prosecutions in the world. If you can't find them, it's not going to help. You can find my phone, you can find my automobile. Heck, for all I know, you can probably find my underwear. I don't know. But we can't find drone owners because we haven't required a simple item to be installed on it. If you want to do size, do size. By the way, at Logan, we get a lot of geese. You can't control geese, but we chase them around. We get dogs that chase them around. They have a great time. We do something. Maybe there are better ways to do it, but we do something. Something is always better than nothing in the face of a known danger. Like I said, I wasn't going to say anything you didn't already know, but thank you for listening.
Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. K, I'll call you Dr. K. Let me go to you.
That's what my students call me.
Let me go to you. In your opening testimony, you talked about mid-air collisions and how the magnitude would be more significant in certain areas and negligible in others. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, coming from the rural area of western North Carolina, where you would assume most of it would be safe, but there's a number of small airstrips, grass strips, et cetera. So illuminate if you would.
Yeah. So when I was at Lincoln Laboratory, we got a stream of radar data from all of the FAA and DoD radars. And we estimated the density across the United States at different altitude layers and so forth. And there are a lot of areas where we just didn't see anything in 9 months.
So could we put forth certain counties where we have zone-free, drone-free zones or drone permissible? Is there certain counties across the country where there's relatively little, if no chance of having interaction with an aircraft?
I guess that could be a possibility.
That's a loaded question, so go ahead.
It depends so much upon the altitude, right?
Yeah.
So that has to be part of the figure. I mean, I wouldn't, even over rural North Dakota or whatever, you shouldn't be at 20,000 feet.
All right, so let me go further then. How would you classify near miss? What's your definition?
So I did a lot of collision risk estimation for TCAS. TCAS was mentioned earlier. It's a collision avoidance system for manned aircraft, and the FAA is working on a version for unmanned aircraft. And as part of that analysis, we used a definition of 500 feet laterally and 100 feet vertically. So that's for manned aircraft. And there's nothing magical about this definition. It's just it's just what we
So,
do.
Captain, would you agree with that definition of near miss? Is that satisfactory?
Currently, there exists a criteria for a near-miss report. And that's
Yeah, I'm talking about his definition. Would that be satisfactory to the airline pilots?
I don't believe so, sir, because it doesn't provide any near what we would need to avoid the collision.
Can you get to the chairman of this committee what you would estimate a near miss would be? And
I'm not sure we're equipped to do that analysis, sir. but we can.
Well, can you query your pilots and ask them to opine on it? How about that?
Yes, sir. We can ask and gather as much information as possible.
Let me go real quickly and finish up. Mr. Whitaker, some have suggested that your rulemaking has not been expeditious. And I believe in your earlier testimony here, you were talking about doing rulemaking for commercial drones when, I guess you said, the commercial viability and economic viability increase. Did I hear you correctly on that?
I think the question was around large UAS.
Right.
Yes.
And that you would, so there is a certain mentality that says if you build it, they will come. And your testimony here today is if they build it, we will regulate it?
No, we're trying to move in lockstep with both commercial demand and the technology.
But Mr. Whitaker, let me suggest that you are more forward-thinking in terms of regulations. The ambiguity of FAA doing nothing creates the kind of dynamics that we have here today, both on the commercial and on the hobby side of things. And the more finite you can be, the better that commercial activity will be in terms of meeting your expectation. If we wait until to draw the regulations until we have problems, as we're trying to do today, it creates much uncertainty in the market. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
So how do we best move your rulemaking faster as it relates to the near misses that we're talking about here and allow us to compete in drones? Because if not, if we're going to lose out to the drone technology in Europe. We've had other testimonies sitting at that very table that would suggest that. So how do we make sure that you're nimble and do that effectively? And I'm out of time, so I'll yield back. And
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe the FAA has a definition of near miss that's already in regulation that's a lot larger than what the professor mentioned. But anyway, we can check that out. I'd like to direct my comments to the administrator, but if any of the rest of you want to weigh in, I appreciate that. You know, I represent Las Vegas, and I was a strong proponent of Nevada being named one of the original test centers for this kind of technology. And you mentioned that that they are there for collaboration and research. But what seems to have happened is that these test sites have kind of fizzled out. There's not a lot of attention there. They kind of don't know what their goal is, what they should be doing. I'd like to get you to comment on that. What can these test sites be doing? What's the FAA doing to encourage and support them? Seems like the FAA's now got all its attention on granting these Section 333 exceptions as opposed to working with the test sites. What's the point of them now? If you'd address that. And I would also ask you that when you grant these exceptions, do you continue to get information from these facilities that now can fly? And how do you use that information to inform this process of regulation development? Or is that just once they get the exception, they're out there and we don't know what's going on?
Yes, ma'am. The test sites, the 6 test sites are designed to provide an infrastructure for testing so that the private sector can use them and other researchers can use them for flight tests and other testing. We've tried to streamline the approval process to a large degree, which I think we've done. But at the same time, they're also designed to be a marketplace, so they have to compete for that work. And some test sites have been more successful at others in that. We have been meeting with all the test sites over the last 2 months to try to help jumpstart and facilitate some of that work. To your second point, the tech center has a role in accumulating the data from the test site operations and collating that data and using it for supporting our research efforts.
Anybody else care to comment on whether these test sites are working like they should, or we're getting enough information from them, or they don't make much difference?
I think industry, ma'am, as they start to see the value of the test site, because while I'm not a technician, I'm not a designer, but the company that comes up with a small, lightweight, universally powered, active collision avoidance system that's priced at a point that can be placed on almost any aerial system, that company's going to make a lot of money. And their best place to test these are the existing test sites. So I think it's a good program moving forward.
I'd like to go back to the administrator, and part of my question was about granting all the Section 333 exemptions. That seems to be where most of your energy and effort is concentrated now, instead of supporting technology and testing and data collection. Is that accurate, or?
Well, I would say those are different functions, and Section 333 has certainly gotten a lot of attention, but it's a different group, if you will, within FAA that does that. We have research going on with MITRE Corporation, in conjunction with NASA and DoD, at the Tech Center and at the Center of Excellence. So we're focused on all of those things, and they're all part of the puzzle going forward.
So do you get information back after you've granted an exemption to one of these companies, or?
Not necessarily for commercial exemptions, although we do have some commercial partnerships where we are taking that data and analyzing it.
Wouldn't that be helpful for making up these regulations?
Well, it's not a restriction. We've issued 1,800 333 exemptions. It's not a restriction that we feel is appropriate for commercial operators to mandate that type of work.
So you don't think it would be helpful to find out what these
It might be
exemptions
helpful
are
in
doing?
some that are willing to do that. We have partnered with.
So it's voluntary?
That's correct.
And if you look at the way that the agency is set up, is there more priority, more effort, more energy put into granting these exceptions than in the testing and the technology and the centers?
No, I would say they're not linked. And as the small rule gets finalized, that 333 process will be dramatically reduced.
But shouldn't they be linked? You're the one who used the term of collaboration about the test sites.
Well, they're linked as far as exchange of information, but the 333 approval process is a different workforce than the research coordination.
Right, but isn't that where the priority is now, instead of on the testing and getting information to make these regulations?
Priority would be on both of those.
How do you measure that?
Well, we measure the 333s by throughput, and on the test sites and the research, it's not amenable to immediate sort of metric measurements, but there is a lot of research, a lot of effort going into that.
Okay. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford.
Thank you, Chairman. It strikes me, I guess, three things hit me. One, that unmanned is if it's not the future of flight, it's certainly the next frontier of flight. Two, that there's been a long-time fascination with flight, going back to the days of Da Vinci and moving forward to the Wright brothers. And three, that we want to encourage innovation on that front, and in general, government regulation, control, and other inhibits that innovation that I think is vital ultimately to American competitiveness. So we want to have, kids out there fiddling with something, saying, well, if we tie these 3 rocks onto it, will it fly as well? I mean, at the base level, kids in the basement of a garage working with some of this stuff may well lead to innovations and new developments with regard to unmanned flight that I think could have commercial applications and certainly competitiveness applications. And so, what's hit me in sort of listening to testimony today is, how do we get to a place that's minimally invasive with regard to unmanned, and how do we get to a place that keeps government out of involvement as much as possible so that we maximize individual freedom without in any way interrupting commercial flight or non-commercial flight. And so I was intrigued by what my colleague from California had gotten at, and my colleague from North Carolina in the same basis. How do we come up with something that's really simple, whether that's the kind of legislation he talked about, so that you don't end up with a bunch of, things being tacked onto this equipment that raises the price, that keeps, frankly, many consumers out of the marketplace? How do you keep up with some massive database, and then we got to hire more bureaucrats to cover the database that watch the 90% of folks who wouldn't be a problem? How do we do something quite simple, whether that's the Garamendi language or something else? And I guess I'd begin with you. Any ideas from your end, Doctor, on something that you may have seen in a different country as a best practice, or something that you may have heard about in talking with other colleagues that would indeed be minimally invasive?
Yeah, so I think an altitude limit is minimally invasive, very easy to implement. That's something that we can do now.
But if I understand it right, it wouldn't solve the problem of, you go to 400 feet, but if you're 400 feet off final, then you got a problem.
Yeah, so I mean, trying to solve the whole problem is very complicated and will take time. 400 feet is something that...
Okay, that would be your vote. We'll keep it moving. Mr. Hansen, your thought, quick thought, most simple remedy would be what?
I believe that the community-based approach has proven for decades to be an effective way of handling at least the model aircraft / hobby environment, and I would look to that to continue keeping this operation.
Community-based model. Captain Carroll.
So outside of the community base, those who are operating outside of that, the altitude restriction will help, but also if there was a way to restrict the enabling of the vehicle when you purchase it until a code is put in, that you need to get that code, you have to go online and pass a test. And now you know, oh, that's right, I can't go to the airport because I couldn't get my code without passing the test.
Code. Mr. Hubbard.
Until technology catches up, public awareness.
Mr. Whitaker.
I would say the most efficient way to get there is an industry-based standard so we don't have to go down the regulatory path, and that involves stakeholder engagement, which we're also focused on.
I very much like that idea of industry standard versus government edict. One quick question, because I see I'm down to 52 seconds, and I guess this would be directed to you, Mr. Hansen. Going back to that idea of industry standard, how would you describe the way in which AMA develops and educates its members and the general public about sort of modeling guidelines and safety at large? You talk about community standard, you talk about sort of industry standard. How do you all do that presently?
Well, currently within our membership, a lot, if not the majority of our education is done at the local club level, where the local people come together and gather in a club and share information. In terms of the broader membership, we do that through our Mainstay magazine, through our online presence, and then in terms of the uneducated consumer, we're doing that through the Know Before You Fly campaign.
I see I have 1 second left, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm down to 0.
Thank you for yielding back that second. Mr. Sanford, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Chief Hubbard, in your testimony, you said the Forest Service and the Department of Interior are developing a summary of the 2015 field season, and you'll make recommendations. When can we expect to see that summary?
The summary of the incursions?
Yeah.
Yes, we have that available now.
Oh, okay. All right. It's available now. Are you making recommendations from that summary?
No, that's just capturing what we've encountered, and we turn to FAA and others for recommendations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one of the instances in California, you reported that 5 aircraft were delayed for 20 minutes. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. What impact can a 20-minute delay have on your ability to contain or suppress a fire? What happens in 20 minutes?
In backcountry fires, not a lot. It gets bigger. In interface fires where you have life and property at risk, it of course depends on the situation, but it could be dramatic.
Define dramatic.
Loss of property for sure, and sometimes putting lives at risk.
Yeah, yeah. After we get a chance to review the summary, maybe do some follow-up with you on just to understand better what steps we might take. So then FAA and you all have worked on it. Do you have an MOU, is that right, or an MOA?
MOA, yes, sir.
MOA. And what's in that MOA?
How we want to proceed together to try to resolve these kinds of issues, because we know we're an outlier in terms of our statistics and our operating altitudes. And it's going to be a little more complicated, so we need some help.
How many millions of acres did you say were on fire in the West this year?
We burned 9 million acres.
9 million. What was the other number that you had? I mean, how many individual fires were there?
47,000 fires.
Is that an outlier?
No.
So I don't think you're an outlier. I don't think so.
Great.
Mr. Whitaker, how do you confirm that there have been situations where drones have come inappropriately close to aircraft? There's been some questions about confirming these, whether they are or they aren't. How does the FAA come around and confirm these? Well, I think as others have discussed, they are difficult to confirm. We don't have end numbers on these things that we can see. We don't have an ability to locate them the way we would with a laser, for example. And that's just the nature of the data. So it's very raw data. I think what we can say is that the trend in the data is pretty obvious. So the number of reports on a monthly basis now is at over 100, and that's a 5-fold increase from a year ago. So you can argue around the margins, but I don't think there's any question that there's a significant trend.
Yeah, yeah. And Captain Connell, how do you confirm, how does ALPA confirm these numbers?
Well, the information we get is on an anecdotal basis, and then we point our members to the website, which helps them refresh their memory on the criteria for a near-air collision report. And then if in their mind, which is the determinative factor in this instance, they believe they had one, we point them to the various links at the FAA so they can fill the form out and submit the report. That's beyond the report that happens real time, where the pilot says, hey, there's one of those X-wing drones, presses the ident button on his transponder and calls the tower or the approach control and says, I just observed this. And then the controller can say, okay, that's a data point for us.
Yeah.
And can warn the aircraft behind them. That's very important.
Yeah, right. And Dr. Kaye, you're the technology guy. How would you suggest we clean that up? How to confirm these sites?
Yeah, it's really tough if you just rely upon pilot reports, and I don't want to diminish the severity of this, but there have been, well, at least one case where the pilot thought they hit a drone, and it turned out later to be a bird. So it's very tricky. So what you would have to rely upon is some kind of surveillance system, perhaps something near an airport that could actually capture these things.
Yeah, yeah. Can you talk a little bit as well about, and this will be my final question, just so I want to understand, without getting into the gory details, but the difference between an engine taking in a bird and an engine taking in either a composite material drone or a drone that's metal based.
Yeah. So I should clarify that engine ingestion is not my area of expertise, but I've talked with some people, and we don't really know. And I was very happy to hear that the FAA is pursuing that. But I mean, it's not rocket science. It has probably something to do with the size of the drone, the components it's made out of, and so forth.
Sure. So we'll think about that. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
It's always tough to follow my colleague talking about engine digestion or ingestion or indigestion. So, great question, Mr. Larson. Hey, thank you for being here. I apologize. Multiple hearings today, so if I'm redundant with any of my questions, please forgive me. But I have a concern. I represent Central Illinois, home to some of the manufacturers of our newer types of hobby aircraft and UAV technology, and also home to many possible users of this technology for commercial use. And I know a lot of discussion was on the exemption program that's currently being implemented and run through the FAA. And part of my concerns have to do with some previous hearings like this, where we talked about the exemption process moving very slowly to offer commercial exemptions to those who have applied. And now, since they've sped up, what we've seen is some of the older requests being limited versus some of the newer requests in what can be done with the technology that they've applied for the exemption for. And Mr. Whitaker, I appreciate that your process has evolved at the FAA, but I think there might be a concern where older applicants and older exemptions that were issued may need to have some of the newer flexibility that some of the newer exemptions that are being issued currently enjoy. So can you tell me Is there a process in place at the FAA right now to look at some of the older applications to see if they need that same type of flexibility? And if so, are you going to do that unilaterally, or is that something that the previous applicants have to do?
So this is not a concern that I've heard expressed before, but it sounds like a concern that the newer exemptions have more flexibility that would normally be triggered by the current holders coming back for some adjustment to their 333 application. But
so they would have to come back personally to change the operational conditions that they may have to.
As opposed to us changing the conditions for them. But I'll look into that and respond to your office.
Well, please do. It is a concern of those in my district who have been possibly granted exemptions that may now be outdated. And I do believe, and I hope that you take this back, that we need to have some flexibility in that process, because the technology has changed even over the time that this exemption program was implemented. Absolutely. And the technology that's being produced in my district is going to continue to evolve unless we here in the federal government stop its ability to evolve and to continue to grow into what I think should be commercial usage and a much more flexible commercial usage for UAV technology, and to do it in a safe way. But I think that can happen. And while I have time left, I will not butcher your name like my colleague, Mr. Larson, didn't either, since I wasn't here to get the correct pronunciation. I'll call you Dr. K again, too.
That's just
Can you give me an idea of how maybe transponder technology could be helpful in avoiding some of the collisions, some of the issues that I think the FAA is facing right now, and we are too as policymakers?
Yeah, so if unmanned aircraft are going to be flying at the level of transport aircraft or even up with general aviation aircraft, in order to be seen by TCAS and so forth, they need to have some kind of transponder.
Wouldn't that transponder technology work at lower level flights, like life flights?
It could work as well. I'm not sure how many life flight helicopters have TCAS installed. But it's a possibility. The problem, though, is that the cost of these transponders, including ADS-B out, are pretty expensive, and they consume power and they're heavy. So for a lot of these larger aircraft, it makes sense and should be absolutely required. But for smaller drones, maybe a couple pounds.
So the technology for lightweight transponder technology does not currently exist for the newer versions of UAV, right?
There's a lot of interest in actually developing this, and this is an activity of Google, in fact.
An entrepreneurial dream.
Yep.
An entrepreneurial dream. Okay.
Yep.
And how do you pronounce your last name, since I don't have any more time?
It's Kokendorfer.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll recognize myself for just a few moments. Mr. Whitaker, you talked about the difference between going after folks with serious penalties when they did not learn their lesson versus trying to train folks up. I'm thinking about the number of incursions on restricted airspace by licensed pilots, by trained pilots, by pilots flying planes with transponders. I see those incursions into restricted airspace listed in the thousands. Do you happen to know how many of those folks have faced serious penalties versus just been trying to be trained up?
So you're talking about incursion between manned aircraft?
That's right.
Yeah, I don't have statistics on that. Our compliance philosophy would largely be the same, that we'd be focused on remediating the problem and making sure there's compliance as a first step before moving to enforcement.
I'm told the maximum financial penalty for one of those restricted airspace incursions is $1,100. I think Mr. Micah from Florida has legislation to increase that to $100,000. But I just want to contrast that for a moment with what we're talking about with unmanned vehicles today. Captain, you're one of my bosses, so I take you at your word when you tell me how we can solve problems. But I have heard a lot about adding technology to these $55 drones to keep them out of restricted airspace. Yet no one is making that same suggestion for $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 manned aircraft. Is the importance of keeping folks out of restricted airspace such that before we start talking about adding technology to $55 drones, we should be adding it to $55,000 aircraft?
So I think it's a multi-layered problem. It's not only the financial penalties for manned aircraft. Straying into restricted airspace will ultimately result in you losing your license to operate the aircraft. And tracking who's the operator of the unmanned aerial system is difficult. So that's where part of the conflict is. I think we have to look at it both. And, you know, I don't know the numbers either, but I do know we have programs in the manned aircraft community, such as ASAP, where if you make a mistake in an aircraft, we're human, and we do make mistakes, you have a way of reporting it, and that report is gathered into a very large database, and we can do analysis on it. That does, to my knowledge, doesn't exist for the commercial operation of unmanned systems yet. I think it would be a good idea for us to look at it.
Having that reporting database might be even more powerful as a dictator of behavior than having some of the technological restrictions across the board.
I think they're both important, but to have the database of someone who could voluntarily report, hey, I lost command of my vehicle for this amount of time, and I think it was because of this, then we can look towards mitigations for the problems that they experience in the future.
Doctor, you suggested in response to one of my colleagues' questions that one of the easy answers would be an altitude restriction. My guess is we're either going to have to change the strength of the transmitter or put an altimeter in every unmanned aircraft to make that effective. Is that what you had in mind, a technology solution to create an altitude restriction, not just a rule that then would be left up to individuals about whether they abided by it or not?
Yeah, I think that something should be enabled by default because, like I said, when you pull it out from underneath the Christmas tree, a lot of people just try to see how high they can go. And we really want to prevent things like that. But it should be allowed to be overridden because a lot of these consumer drones are used by legitimate operators like law enforcement and so forth.
Well, that was, in fact, the very first line of the captain's written testimony, is this is obviously an industry that has great benefit potential for American, for quality of life, for safety of pilots, and how can we come together on that? I'll close with this, then I'd ask each one of you. In the context of terrorism, I'd tell you there are an unlimited number of folks who want to do us harm. I'm sorry, an unlimited number of ways to do us harm, but a limited number of folks who want to do it. In this area that we're talking about today, unlimited number of ways that accidents can happen by untrained personnel, limited number of folks who really out there day in and day out to violate the rules, as the FAA has indicated just this week. Is that the challenge, Doctor, not to find a one-size-fits-all aircraft solution, but to go after those folks who would intentionally violate whether it be industry standards or federal regulatory standards?
In my written statement, I categorize the different kinds of users. So I worry a lot about the naive users and the reckless users. I think bad actors are a separate category, and I would have to say that there's relatively little we can do about that right now.
Mr. Hansen, should we be focused on the naive users or the bad actors?
Well, I think intentional acts need to be dealt with, and I think there are existing laws and sanctions that can be put in place to do that. The naive or the uneducated community is one that we really need to focus on because we firmly believe, and our experience shows us, that the users are good-natured and conscientious individuals that just need the proper information.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, then I thank all of the witnesses for their testimony and their indulgence today, and the committee stands adjourned.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.